So, before the break, we started talking about the SDG data structure definition, how it came about. And now, very quickly, let's go over the SDG DSD. And let's start with dimensions. The SDG DSD has 16 dimensions. And the first one is frequency, FREQ. I talked about that before. The rate of occurrence of observations like annual, monthly, quarterly, and so on. The important thing to remember is for the SDG data exchange, you always use the annual frequency. You use frequency A, which means that in principle you don't need that dimension in the first place, which is correct, but again, for compatibility purposes, this dimension is included. The bottom line is you always indicate frequency annual, and if it's actually not quite annual, for example, 2-year average, then you specify the detail in the time detail attribute. The point is that SDG indicators are never sub-annual, so the annual frequency is good. Reporting type. Used to distinguish between national, regional, and global reporting. As you are representatives of your countries, you always use N. You never use anything other than N. You never use G. N reports to the region of data. Data, not indicators, not nothing else. Anything reported by the country must always use reporting type M. And anything reported by the custodian agency, regardless of how they obtained it, must always use G. So, forget R, forget G, always use N with your data. Series, we have already talked about it during the exercise. It's a sub-indicator, which is why this term is used instead of the indicator. And the single SDG indicator can cover several series. For example, if you look at 551, proportion of series held by women in national parliaments, you will see that it's got 4 series. Right? So in this case, the indicator is an umbrella for 4 series. Any questions? Please don't hesitate to interrupt. Reference area, again, we've talked about that a lot. We don't have to do that, go over it in detail. You can use alpha 2 or M49 codes. What's also important about the SDG global data structure definition is it only contains reference areas at national level or above. It does not include any subnational areas. No provinces, no cities, no nothing. Which is why, if you want to customize the DSG for national use, the first thing you need to do, typically, is take ownership of the reference area code list and add your provinces. Any questions? No questions? Let's go on. Dimension sex, pretty easy. Male or female. Underscore T for total. If not applicable, you use underscore T. You have a number of indicators which are not disaggregated by sex, but they are gender indicators. So, proportion of seats held by women in national parliament. This series is not disaggregated by sex. It's only provided for women. For this series, you must use sex F. And we have content constraints that enforce that. Why it's important is it's usually relatively easy when you use Excel to map your data, but when you map your data to the database, then it can get tricky. Because if you have a database with your development indicators, very often this indicator, this series, will not have sex attached to it. And then you have to be extra careful with mapping this indicator to ensure that it's exported into SDMX with sex. Age. Again, age groups, underscore T when not applicable. When you have age-specific indicators, such as under 5 mortality rates or proportion of children stunted, then you must use the appropriate age group. Oh, jeez. I thought I fixed it. This is correct as of June this year, but it's no longer correct because we have extended the organization code list. And if you go to the global registry and look up the code list, then you will see that it has 2 more codes now. These codes are not cross-domain codes either, because they were created before The SDG&UNSD was created before the cross-domain code was developed. Furthermore, for some reason, this is simply wrong. Because an attempt to fix it right away. Because it's not underscore U, it's U, it's not underscore R, it's R. So now it's correct. Yeah. Again, disaggregation by urban-rural location. And if you look at the code list, you will see two more code. I think for semi-dense urban areas. But this one is usually very easy to use. Income or wealth quantile. This is used for disaggregating data by income or wealth quintile of the population. The World Bank uses that a lot, for example. Why it's called quantile and not quintile is because quantile is the more generic term. And in the future, this dimension can be used to disaggregate by decile, percentile, and so on. Education level. Highest level of an educational program the person has successfully completed. In theory, in practice in the SDGs dataset, as in others, education level is also used to classify schools, such as primary schools, secondary schools. So not just persons, also establishments. But it's usually not a huge deal. It supports top categories of FISCAT 11, FISCAT 97, and custom education SDGs. Occupation. Job or position held by an individual, I think is fairly straightforward. It has top categories of ISCO 08, ISCO 98, ISCO 68, as well as custom SDG codes. Disability status. It's used to break down the SDG indicators by the person's disability status. Disability status means that it only has three codes: total, persons with disability, and persons without disability. It doesn't go into any code in the same. Economic activity. That's basically ISIC. And it has top level ISIC continuous underscore T or not applicable. Used for economic indicators. Type of product, this is a difficult one because different SDG indicators supplied by different custodian agencies use different classifications of products. FAO uses Central Product Classification, CPC. UNEP uses the material flows classification of products. And then we have non-standard classifications as well, which we tried to map to the existing classification, but it was so difficult that the regions of the data was much help the agency, so we gave up. But bottom line is that this dimension is used to disaggregate by product or conversion. Now, this is where it gets tricky. Custom breakdown. Typically, when you have a code list, we have a code and a meaningful label attached to it. For example, if you look at the sex code list, you have code M and label male. Code F and label female. Code underscore T and label total. And this is what is part of the data structure. In the case of custom breakdown, we have generic codes. CO1, code 1. CO2, code 2. C225, code 225, and so on and so forth. In other words, the GSD doesn't tell you anything about these codes. They're just there. When you transmit your data, that's when you define the meaning of your codes using attribute fast breakdown LB. So the semantics of the code is defined at runtime instead of design time. It's defined when you generate your data set instead of when you create your data structure definition. And the same code like CO2 or C225 can mean very different things and will mean very different things usually in different data sets. You might ask, why do you need this? I mean, first of all, is this a good thing to use? Based on your experience, what do you think about this? It's bad. It's really, really bad. It's really difficult to use. And it's very confusing to the user when the same code can mean different things in different situations. So then the question is, why do you need that? And the answer is that the SDG is so heterogeneous that you can have a breakdown which is extremely volatile. I'll give you an example of that. We receive an indicator, I can't recall exactly which one now, disaggregated by weather sampling stations. Now, the IMO somewhere maintains a list of weather sampling stations in the world. But there are tens of thousands of them. And each year, they would send us, not the IMO, well, I don't recall which they send us a data set with data disaggregated by a different sample of weather stations. Bottom line is that for us to maintain a code list of weather stations would be extremely difficult because the code list is extremely volatile. It changes all the time. We are not the custodian of this code list, right? Furthermore, you only have one or two indicators disaggregated by that. So you would introduce a huge complexity to the GSD for the sake of just two indicators. In order to enable that, to provide for this type of situation, that's what the custom breakdown was introduced. You can still transmit this information. You can still provide all the semantics, but instead of doing it at design time, you do it at runtime. So this is not an elegant approach. This is a workaround made necessary by the nature of the SDGs. Any questions about this? And this is actually a custom breakdown. It's widely used. It's not, again, it's a workaround for difficult situations, but it's widely used in global infrastructures, including macroeconomic statistics. And then another so-called mixed dimension, composite breakdown. Now, typically, when you have a code list, you want it to be clean. You don't want to mix different concepts in the same code list. So if you have a code list for sex, You want it to have male, female, and total. You don't want it to have male, female, primary school, secondary school, high school, teacher, statistician, IT professional. You don't want to mix different concepts in the same code list. However, the SDG data structure definition has 16 dimensions already. And there are many indicators which are broken down, which are disaggregated by a dimension, by a breakdown that is not used in any other indicator. A lot of them. And so what do you have? You have 230 indicators which are not disaggregated by international organization, and one indicator which is disaggregated by international organization. And for the sake of that one indicator, you need to create an additional dimension. If we use this approach, the proper approach, then one is the SDG-DSD would have probably 45 or 50 dimensions, or even more. And two is would be adding dimensions with every release, or almost every release of the DSD, which would make it extremely difficult to use. So, what this tells you is that the SDG data set is very sparse, which is not surprising because it's almost always the case with multi-domain data sets. So in order to manage this complexity, in order to enable those disaggregations without blowing up the dimensionality and without increasing the sparsity even further, composite breakdown was introduced, which is basically a single code list that is used for many concepts. So if you look into the composite breakdown code list, you will see breakdowns by international organization, hazard type, migratory status, various international protocols and agreements, and so on and so forth. Each one of them is only used in very few series of indicators. So this is how we manage complexity of the SDG data set. But on the flip side, the thing is that if you have two breakdowns in the composite breakdown code list, you cannot use them at the same time. You can use one at a time. This is something you have to remember. This is a major downside of the composite breakdown approach. Okay? So, custom breakdown and composite breakdown are often called mixed dimensions or wildcard dimensions. Time period. By convention, the frequency is always annual, and time period is always a calendar year. 2022, 2023. If you have any additional information about time, you put that into the time detail attribute, which is basically a. You can also do a fully structured time period information into the time coverage attribute. And the primary measure is concept ODS underscore value, unsurprisingly, and it's a floating point number. Observation status. It's a cross-domain attribute used in all global data structures. It's not very widely used in the case of the SDG/GSD, but you can still use it to indicate like a break-in series, whether the value is estimated, and so on and so forth. It's a mandatory attribute. Unit multiplier, we've talked about that. Again, the thing to remember is about unit multiplier is this is the exponent of 10. So you use 0 for number in simple units, 0, because 10 to the power of 0 is 1. You use 2 for hundreds, if you have that, 3 for thousands, 6 for millions, 9 for billions, and so on. You may ask, why do you need this stupid attribute? This is what I asked myself when I first saw that. To me, it seemed to be so like 1970s when they were trying to, storing numbers in thousands or millions because storage was so expensive, and they tried to save a couple of bytes for every record. However, actually, later when I started working on data exchange, I really appreciate the value of this attribute. Why it's important is that it makes it much easier to map your original data to a data structure definition. Suppose that for whatever reason, you have an indicator in your database which is in thousands. It doesn't matter what reason. It was legacy, it was a decision made long ago. You never worked with that indicator in units, you always work with it in thousands and so on. Without this unit multiplier attribute, you would have to transform this number in order to export it. You would have to multiply it by thousands in order to map it to the data structure definition. With that attribute, you don't have to transform anything. All you have to do is specify unit multiplier 3. So this approach is obviously, it's much, much easier to set the value of the attribute properly than to transform the data before exporting that. So it's actually this attribute can be very, very useful. Unit of measure. In the case of the SDG/GSD, it's an attribute, it's mandatory, and it's attached to the time series. We've talked about that before during the understanding. This is a very important one. It's time detailed. It's a footnote. It's a free text attribute, so I can put anything into it. But as the example here gives you, if you have a survey that ran from the 1st of July 2021 to the 30th of June 2022, what you can do is you can put 2022 into the time period and 2021, 2022 into time detail. Or you can create a more informative note, something like 1st July 21 to the 30th June 22. It's a duration level and it's conditional or optional. Time coverage is structured representation of the time period. It's not very widely used. However, if you are fixed on that, if you want to provide exactly the period over which the data was collected, you can use this to provide a structured time interval in the format ISO 8601. Base period, in the context of the SDGs, it's almost always used it's always used with constant price series. So if you have a series in 2005 US dollar, then 2005 goes into the base period attribute. Don't forget that. It's optional because you don't have a lot of constant constant price series. But when you have a constant price series, please make sure to set it. Nature, there is some overlap between nature and observation status, but the bottom line is nature is primarily for the global data set. The countries should use code C for country data. The rest is for the international custodian agencies for their model data, estimate, and so on and so forth. You may wish to use observation status, which should be sufficient for your purposes. Source detail, we talked about that during the exercise. So essentially, it's a footnote on source of the data. It's an optional pretext attribute attached to the observation. Upper bound and lower bound, countries almost never have to use these attributes. It's for model data. And if your observation is a point estimate, then upper bound and lower bound, that's what it's used to do, to represent the confidence interval for upper and lower bound for model data. But basically, if you do have a confidence interval, then you can use upper and lower bound for this purpose. We have two attributes for footnotes. Comment underscore OBS and comment underscore TS. The former is attached to the observation, the latter is attached to the time series. So when you disseminate or transmit your data, you may choose one or the other depending on your. If you can use time series, then it's better to use time series because it is more efficient. GeoInfo URL provides web address of the geoinformation file. If you want to use, if you want to attach a map with your data, your series, then you can use the attribute GeoInfo URL to provide the URL of a map. And the attribute GeoInfo type specifies the type of the geoinformation map, which is the file. So, we've covered the dimensions and attributes, and now let's talk about data flows. There are two global data flows defined for the SDGs. Harmonized global data flow and country global data flow. The harmonized global data flow, it's used by the custodian agencies, by the World Bank, ILO, UNICEF, UNEP, WHO, UNDP, IMF, and all the others to report their data to UNSD. The country global data flow is used by countries to report data to UNSD, not just to UNSD, also to ESCWAT, maybe to the ADB and others. But the bottom line is that the harmonized global data flow is used to report global source data, national country global data flow is used to report national source data. Both of these, just to be clear, are for global indicators only. They are both data flows defined on the SDG Global Data Structure definition and can only be used for global indicators. For national indicators, which are not part of the global framework, you create your own GSD and your own indicators. Any questions about this? Yes.
I have a question about the NAFO report that the national should send to agency. Each agency has the same report or same report.
The custodian agency. This is basically between the country and the custodian agency. We don't intervene into that at UNSD. But if a country sends SDG indicators to the custodian agency, it should use the country global data. I'll tell you what the problem is with the SDG terminology. The thing is, a country, when it publishes SDG indicators, some of them will be global and some of them will be national. And then you always have confusion. When a country reports global indicators, are they global indicators or are they national indicators? And the answer is they're national indicators because the global indicators are already supported by the custodian agency. So you have global indicators, national global indicators, and national indicators. It's confusing and it's easy to get lost in all that. The data flows here, they are all strictly for the global SDG indicators. Because the only thing that you can use the global SDG for is to report global SDG indicators. But the same indicator can be reported, for example, working poor, the indicator we just looked at, employed populations below the poverty line. It can be reported by the ILO against the harmonized global data flow, regardless how it was obtained. And when Thailand reports this same indicator, it uses the country global data. All right? But then you can create your own national DSD and national data flow. And typically the national DSD will be a superset of the global DSD. It will have all the global indicators plus your own national indicators, which are not part of the global framework. And you can use this data flow to report all of your DSD. Just not report. You cannot report using national DSD. Disseminate all of your global and national indicators together on this data. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Let's talk about content constraints. We have two cube region global content constraints attached to two data flows. CN SDG GLC attached to the country global data flow ensures that any data reported against the country global data flow has reporting type set to N. If you try to report your data or even convert your data using reporting type G, it will fail. And remember, whether the indicators you are converting are part of the global framework or your own national indicators, that's irrelevant. For the global SDG data flow, you always use reporting type N national. And a similar constraint attached to the data flow DF-SDG-GLH. The harmonized global data flow ensures that on the harmonized global data flow, the reporting type is always G. Global. So when the custodian agencies report their data, they must set reporting type G. Any questions about this? I mean, it's very easy for you as representatives of the countries. Always use reporting type N. Always use the country global data flow DF SDG GLC. Don't attempt to use any. And this is where it gets really interesting. Serious content constraints, which were only published last year. Serious level content constraints define relationships among dimensions of the global SDG-GSD. It's the serious content constraints that are used to ensure that for indicated proportions of serious proportions of seats held by women in the national parliament, the sex is always set to F. Whereas for indicated land area covered by forest, sex is always set to _T, and age is also set to _T. So we have two such content constraints, each one attached to its own data flow. In terms of content, the constraints are now identical, but in the future they may become different because the data reported by custodian agencies and countries can be different and will require different content constraints. But for now, they're identical. So, you can look at the content constraints at the SDMX Global Registry. You can download them from the Global Registry or from the SDMX SDG webpage. But to be honest, it's not easy to read content constraints when you look them up at the Global Registry, which is why we created an Excel matrix which is a representation of the SDG series content constraints. Please take note of this matrix and always use it when you map your series, your SDG. It took a lot of effort to compile this matrix, but now it's published, now it's available, it's updated every time the GSD is updated, and sometimes even more often. So please use this. So how to use this matrix? Again, we'll cover it in more detail tomorrow. But so you are mapping the series of, let's say, under 5 mortality rate. And then when you look up this series in the matrix, it will tell you that the only valid unit of measure is per 1,000 live birth. The unit multiplier, anything is acceptable. Sex, anything is acceptable. The only valid age group for this series is 0 to 4 years of age. Urbanization, any code is valid, and then for the other dimensions there is no disaggregation. There is except income, wealth, quantile, for which any code is acceptable. This is very important because it allows you to validate your data before you publish it. What used to happen is that before these content constraints were available is people would map their series and convert their data to SDMX, but when they upload the data to the to SDG Lab, they have errors. It's because the content constraints, they existed in the SDG Lab, but they were not in SDMX, so you couldn't see them. Now the content constraints are available, and when you convert your data, even when you convert your data, if something is not mapped correctly, you'll get an error message. And then you can look up, I mean, ideally you will look up the content constraints before you map your data. But if you do find a situation where you have an error message, then you can look up the content constraints, find out which mapping is wrong, and fix the issue in your data. Any questions about this? No questions? Great. So this slide gives you an overview of the SDG article, of the SDG artifacts. We have at the center, we have the SDG data structure definition, ID SDG. It takes concepts from the concept scheme SDG_concepts. It references the various code lists, CL frag, CL age, CL area, CL product, and then you have the country global data flow with two content constraints attached to cube region and series content constraint. And the harmonized global data flow, again with the cube region and the series content constraints, constant constraint. Any further questions? No questions. Thank you. Okay, we still have 25 minutes, so let's start on the SDMX converter, and we will continue that tomorrow. Before we go on, who has ever used SDMX converter? Please raise your hand. Siddharth, I'm sure you have used SDMX converter. Don't be shy. Yes, yes, please. Jeff. Paul, I'm sure you have used it. If you haven't used SDMX converter, don't raise your hand. But if you have, please raise your hand. All right, so about 50-50. Okay, so let's get started. I think at the last SDMX Global Conference, there was a poll among the participants to find out which tools they were using. SDMX converter came on top. This is the most widely used SDMX tool in the world. What is it? It's a software, it's a tool developed by Eurostat. And as the name implies, it can be used to convert data from a wide variety of formats into SDMX, and vice versa. Supports formats such as CSV, Excel, VSPL, and DAGNES. It can be used to transport non-SDMX data to SDMX, SDMX to non-SDMX, and one SDMX format into another. SDMX converter is not one application, it's more like a suite. Because it's available as a desktop application, command line application, web service, Java library, web application. You can download it from the European Commission website. Now, desktop application, my understanding, I need to confirm this with Eurostat, but my understanding is that the desktop application has been discontinued. They are no longer updating the desktop SDMX converter. So if you want to use SDMX converter during this course, we will be using the web application, kindly installed by the Taiwan National Statistical Office, as well as the Asian Development Bank. It's also available at the European Commission website, where you can register for free. It's a good idea. To transform data to the SDMX converter, you need what? Well, you need the data in the first place, right? That's fairly obvious. What else? What else do you need to convert non-SDMX data into SDMX? Any views? I'm listening. Give me a hand. What else do you need? DSD, absolutely, absolutely. You cannot, whenever you have SDMX, an SDMX data set, it is structured in accordance to a data structure definition. Without a DSD, you cannot do anything. So yes, you need your source data set, non-SDMX data set. You need the data structure definition. What else? You have your data set. You have your data structure. The data set is non-SDMX. What else do you need to transform your non-SDMX data set into SDMX? I'm listening. Yes, Tidara, I think you know the answer. What?
Mapping data.
Yes, thank you. You have your non-SDMX data set, and you have an SDMX DSD. How do you know? How does the computer know which concepts in your CSV file correspond to which concepts in the SDMX DSD? And which codes correspond to which codes of the SDMX DSD? You need mappings. Mappings that show how source data maps to the SDMX DSD. And once you have all that, you get SDMX, an SDMX data set. Read this last bullet point carefully. When you're establishing SDMX exchange reporting, meaning that you are given a GSD and you have your own data set, installing SDMX converter is easy. Getting the GSD is easy. What is not easy is this, the mapping. Whichever technology you use, whether it's SDMX or not SDMX or whatever, mapping is where most of the effort is. With SDMX, actually, it's much easier because you don't need to worry about this part. When you're not using SDMX, Like for example, when I established data exchange of demographic data with cause of death with WHO back in 2006. At that time, there was no SDMX tools. So I had to program everything. Not only do the mappings, actually mappings was the easy part back then, but I have to program everything, how to import the WHO data set and how to map it to the UNSD demographic database. That was then. Now the same thing would be much easier when you already have the data structure definition and you already have the tools. So you don't need to worry about programming. All you need to do is map one data set to the other data set. In this workshop, we will be converting data from Excel to SDMX. You can place the data and the mappings into the same spreadsheet, which we'll be doing. But you can also put the data and mappings into an external file. And you can also add various additional information, instructions, and so on, and put this and so on to facilitate it. So, a worksheet can have one or more data, a spreadsheet, which we're converting to. You can have one or more data worksheets. You can have one or more parameter worksheets. In our exercises, we don't use multiple parameter worksheets, which they can be more than one. So if you only have one parameter worksheet, parameter is basically parameters is your mappings. So if you have 5 data worksheets and a single parameters worksheets, then that parameters worksheets need to be named parameters. Since you are using only one parameters worksheet, that implies that all of your data worksheets have the same layout, the same structure. So, and what that worksheet contains is the information that shows how rows and columns and cells of your data map to the data structure definition. If you have, and the thing is that in this situation, mappings are in the worksheet named parameters, and everything else is considered data unless it starts with VAL. Val worksheets whose name starts with VAL are not processed. That's when you have a single parameter worksheet. When you have multiple parameter worksheets, it's slightly different because then you need to have a worksheet named parameter mapping, and there you specify which parameter worksheets apply to which data worksheets. Then all the worksheets that have not been mapped to the parameter worksheets will not be processed. And if you have any transcoding worksheets, which we'll look at tomorrow, they need to start with props. What we're looking at now is the parameters worksheet, an example. What do we have here? a column named element has a list of what concepts? Track, reporting type, series, reference area, time period, sex, age, organization, income, wealth, clientele, education, level, occupation. All of these, in this case, I mean, this is a parameters worksheet from an SDG data set. So you have SDG concepts here. Type, this is where you put in the role of your concept, dimension or attribute. And where it gets interesting is this. Post-stack composition. This is the mapping type. It shows how the concept maps to your spreadsheet. And we'll be looking at that in more detail. You can have various mapping types. Fixed value, column, row, mixed, and others. Cell. So we'll be looking at that later. Sorry. And this next column, position, this is the type, and this is the value. So in this case, if you look at row 4, it tells you that series maps to column B, and frequency maps to fixed value A. So the actual value or address in this Excel spreadsheet is provided in the column position. And then we have additional parameters which are extremely important and must be specified. Data start always specifies where the data starts. Number of columns is how many observation columns you have in the spreadsheet, and so on. The time is 4:19, and I suggest we stop here and resume at this position tomorrow. But if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them. Yes, you can.
Could you please explain more before you have the Excel mapping, what we have to have before this step, such as we have to the table of data or raw data. Do you have some example what they have look like?
Yes, if we look at exercise 3, for example, which we'll be doing tomorrow. So what you have here is, as you can see, a worksheet with the SDG indicators. So this is your data, and these are the mappings. If you look at the exercise 3, you will see, and you can look at that tonight. It will show you how the concepts of the SDG GSD, and these are the concepts we just covered in the previous presentation, how they map to rows and cells and columns of the data. Any further questions? No questions. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'll see you at 9 a.m. tomorrow. And please don't leave. Because we are slightly behind schedule. It's fine. We'll catch up. But please don't leave. Thank you very much.